Shakuhachi is a flute handmade from bamboo and was introduced into Japan from China in the 7th century. It reached its peak in the Edo period and has since then become a staple of traditional Japanese music. In this video, I'd like to talk a little bit about its historical background, notation, practices, and ultimately how this transfers over to its use in our Western genre of jazz. So first off, the historical significance. It was originally used as a tool for meditation in a solo practice called honkyoku, which translates to original piece. Known for this practice, Japanese Zen Buddhist monks from the Fukui sect were usually ronin or samurai warriors without a master. And they would use this as a tool to control breath and let their mind wander in an attempt to attain enlightenment. So in this style, there's a big concept called ma, which is this feeling of negative space between the notes. It's kind of like a gravity that pulls between the notes, and the whole ensemble just knows where the beat is. Silence can be used as a musical tool, which a lot of people often forget. And it's a lesson I'm often reminded of in private lessons and ensembles alike. In the ensemble, or chamber groups, or minyo, as Japanese folk music calls it, the shakuhachi is played as a guest, and rarely is it the main feature of traditional Japanese groups because of its solo origins coming into pre-established ensembles. Next up, let's talk about construction and notation. I want to mention the fact that the name shakuhachi translates back to an archaic type of measurement and literally is just the length of the instrument. So the shakuhachi has 5 holes, 4 on the front and 1 thumb hole on the back, so its standard pitch content is that of a minor pentatonic. Although it only has those 5 notes, the player is able to manipulate with partial fingerings and breath angles to produce almost any pitch. Now it's not side-blown like our Western flute or the Chinese dechi, but end-blown over the top like one would blow over a bottle. So their notation is a bit tricky to get into from the Western perspective, but I'll do my best to explain it here. So to start out, if you don't already know, traditional Japanese is written and read top, down, left to right. So this is exactly how their notation is as well. Just as we read left to right in a straight line, that's how our music is laid out. So it would make sense that their notation matches their writing style as well. That being said, they don't have staff lines or anything. It's more of a tabulature style with a symbol from their katakana writing system representing a note, and a line either next to it or through it depicting relatively how long it should be held. Think of this kind of like beams in our notation. The key word here is relatively. Honkyoku music never has any time signature or tempo marking, and that's partially because it was originally never written down. Again, these weren't really songs per se, they were meditation tools, and had no real end. They have this sort of gravity, based off a strong beat rather, and a weak beat mindset. The metaphors associated with this music and instrument are a river flowing with no end in sight, and wind blowing through a bamboo groove. I didn't say it was creative, but that's what it is. It was always orally passed down with a master-disciple relationship. Only eventually did they come up with the style of notating it, and even then it was only as a reminder of what the piece was. Because without this passing down, you wouldn't know any of the performance practices, because they didn't write those down because it would just be too messy. So these practices are called korogashi, which are improvisationally applied singing gestures. So think of it kind of like modern-day pop singers. You wouldn't want to notate all of the inflections, melismas, and things they do to the melody, because that would just be a nightmare. Nowadays, we have recordings to listen back over and over to these performances, but back then, they just had to have a teacher. So in their notation style, the 5 basic pitches are as such: ro, tsu, re, chi, and ri. And they only have flats indicated by a meri as a suffix. So ro, meri, tsu, meri, chi, meri, and so on. A double flat is indicated by the suffix chu, meri. A common scale you hear in this music is the Miyakobushi scale, which is a 1, flat 2, 4, 5, and a flat 6. So only 5 modes are used because of the tone color, specifically using weak tones. And these weak tones are alternate fingerings used specifically for the tone color. Otherwise, it just sounds a little flat. The last performance practice I want to mention is pitch vibrato. This is where the vibrato is created by the subtle movement of the head back and forth to change the pitch via air direction instead of from the diaphragm. So on to the jazz. Zach Singer is an American jazz player and composer-arranger who picked up the shakuhachi and started implementing it in jazz after an encounter with it at a jazz club featuring the Tokyo Big Band back in 2012. Since then, he's used his background in jazz to become one of the world's best jazz shakuhachi players. So here's a list of reasons why I think the shakuhachi can fit so well into jazz. The shakuhachi's rich tone color and tenacity lend itself well to jazz music by the way of microtonal chromaticism, the alternate fingerings to color notes in obviously different ways. These tone colors of the weak alternate fingering notes come off kind of like our ghost notes. And Zach Singer uses the shakuhachi very well and brings a whole new sound to the world of jazz. Its improvisatory nature, breathy sound, as well as an affinity for slides and flutter tongue, also lends itself to the jazz idiom quite well. That being said, Zach prefaces all this in an email in an interview that I had with him with this. It doesn't always work so well, that is. If you listen to Hozan Yamamoto playing Take 5, it sounds horrible. He's one of the best shakuhachi players ever, but he didn't give jazz the time or respect it deserves, so it sounds ultra square. The way I try to do it, the shakuhachi is a guest in jazz. I like to think of it as two different languages. Just like we might borrow a word from French, like cliché or déjà vu, we can borrow things idiomatic to the music of shakuhachi to use in jazz vocabulary. If you don't study enough traditional music to internalize them, you'll say the words with an accent, i.e. won't sound natural. If a traditional shakuhachi player doesn't take the time to learn enough about jazz, it'll sound like they're speaking gibberish to a jazz musician, like Yamamoto did when he played it. My goal is to be able to speak each musical vocabulary fluently enough that I don't have to think about it, combining them when I'm playing, so it just happens naturally. So in An American in Tokyo, Zach uses traditional honkyoku sounding solo after the short piano intro and is then rejoined by the piano in a modern style. Notice the space, ma, in the intro, and then notice how he plays with the piano before the rhythm starts. In another song of his, Sanba Samba, it's really a straight-up jazz song with shakuhachi melody and traditional solos with the combo bass, piano, and drums, and trading solos between all of them. And here are just a few examples of how I use it in my own compositions. Alright, so here's the questions for the final. What is a shakuhachi? Answer, it's a Japanese bamboo flute. Question 2, how is its music notated? Top down, left to right. And then question 3, who is Zach Zinger, a professional jazz shakuhachi player? Thanks everybody for watching, and stay safe out there.